The courthouse in Lincoln County was old, the kind of building where the air seemed to hum with secrets of the past. Its brick walls had seen generations of trials, some forgotten, others remembered in whispers. That morning, however, the building felt different. It was alive, breathing with anticipation, every hallway buzzing, every bench filled. People had lined up hours before the session began, hoping for a seat inside. The case had stirred the entire community. On the surface, it looked like another narcotics trial, the kind small towns often tried to sweep under the rug. But this one was different. This one had a face, a young girl, barely 10 years old, who was expected to testify against the man accused. That changed everything. She was not just another witness. She was the key, the fragile thread holding the truth together. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder in the back, their notepads open, pens tapping nervously as they waited for the show to begin. Local families crowded the gallery, whispering behind cupped hands. Even the court officers seemed uneasy, adjusting their uniforms as though bracing themselves for the storm about to break. At the front, the judge's bench loomed high, its polished wood gleaming beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. Judge Harold Chambers, a man known for his stern but fair rulings, adjusted his glasses and scanned the room with the air of someone who knew this day would be remembered long after the verdict. At the defense table sat the accused, Raymond Cross. He was in his late 30s, broad-shouldered with a face that carried both arrogance and weariness. Dressed in a dark suit that didn't quite fit, he leaned back in his chair with a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. His reputation preceded him, slick, manipulative, with a knack for slithering out of tight corners. To his supporters, he was misunderstood. To his critics, he was a predator who finally had nowhere left to run. Across from him, the prosecution team organized their files with sharp precision. Assistant District Attorney Melissa Hayes led the charge, a woman whose reputation for unflinching determination was well known. She had prosecuted men twice Cross's size, and yet today she seemed more focused, more deliberate than ever. Everyone could see that her case rested not just on evidence, but on a child's words. The girl sat quietly at a side bench, waiting for her turn to take the stand. Her legs dangled above the floor, her sneakers swinging slightly, the way children often do when they are nervous. Her name was Emily. She had large brown eyes that seemed far too old for her age, as though she had seen more than any child should. Her small hands clutched a worn stuffed rabbit, a silent companion she had been allowed to bring for comfort. The room hushed as the bailiff called the court to order. The defendant rose, his smirk still plastered on his face, and the jurors filed in. 12 strangers now held the power to decide his fate. Some avoided looking at him altogether, while others studied him with suspicion. Melissa Hayes began her opening statement with a voice steady as steel. She painted a picture of a man who had used fear and control to protect his criminal world, and a child who had lived in the shadows of it. The evidence, she said, would speak for itself. But the truth would not just come from documents or photographs. It would come from the courage of a 10-year-old girl. The defense attorney, Martin Cole, followed with his own performance. He spoke smoothly, confidently, dismissing the prosecution's story as fantasy. Emily, he argued, was just a child easily influenced, unreliable. His words drew a few nods from the jury. He cast the K-9 unit's involvement as theatrics, a gimmick to sway emotions rather than prove facts. By the time he finished, he was smiling like a man who thought he had already won. But even his confidence could not erase the tension hanging in the air. Everyone knew the real moment hadn't arrived yet. It would come when Emily walked to the witness stand and opened her mouth. The hours dragged as preliminary witnesses testified, officers describing the raid, forensic analysts presenting lab results, neighbors recounting the suspicious comings and goings at Cross's house. The testimony was solid, but it lacked the spark that would set the jury on fire. What they were waiting for, what everyone was waiting for, was Emily. As the judge announced a short recess before calling her forward, the courtroom doors opened again. A murmur swept through the gallery as a uniformed officer walked in, holding the leash of a large German shepherd. The dog trotted confidently by his side, tail low but ears alert. The police K9 was a known figure in town. Trained for drug detection, he had been involved in countless operations. But this was different. Never before had he walked into a courtroom like this, head high, as though he too understood the weight of the moment. His handler, Officer Daniels, led him to a corner near the witness stand, giving him a command to sit. The dog obeyed instantly, his sharp eyes scanning the room. Emily turned her head. For the first time since she had entered the courtroom, her nervous fidgeting stopped. Her gaze locked onto the dog, and something flickered across her face recognition, maybe comfort. She straightened slightly, her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosening. Raymond Cross noticed it too. His smirk faltered for just a second as he followed her eyes toward the animal. He shifted in his chair, pretending to be unfazed, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed him. The prosecution team exchanged glances. They hadn't planned for Emily to interact with the dog in any meaningful way, but the moment seemed to be writing itself. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the tension shift. Jurors leaned forward, their interest piqued. It was subtle, but the energy in the room had changed. Judge Chambers cleared his throat, signaling the recess was over. He called for the next witness. "All rise," the bailiff commanded. Emily stood, her small figure dwarfed by the towering form of the courtroom. The hush that fell over the crowd was unlike anything that had come before. Silence so complete, it seemed to press against the walls. She took a deep breath, hugged the rabbit one last time, and then handed it to her guardian before walking slowly to the stand. Her sneakers squeaked softly against the floor with each step. A canine shifted, ears twitching as she passed by. Emily paused for a moment, glancing at the dog again. A calmness seemed to settle over her, as though the presence of the animal anchored her in place. She climbed onto the witness chair, her legs dangling once more. The bailiff approached with the oath, and Emily raised her right hand. The judge studied her closely. The courtroom held its collective breath. No one knew it then, but the events that were about to unfold would make this trial one of the most unforgettable moments in the town's history. And it all began with a child, a dog, and a silence so heavy it felt like the world itself was waiting. The sound of the leash's metal clasp jingling echoed faintly through the courtroom as Officer Daniels guided the German shepherd to his spot. The animal sat tall, muscles rippling beneath his short coat, his posture a mix of obedience and restrained energy. His name was Rex, and though he was trained to remain composed, his eyes never stopped scanning. He watched the jurors, the attorneys, the defendant. He studied the way each person shifted in their seat, as if he understood more than most of the humans in the room. Whispers rippled through the gallery. Some spectators marveled at the sight of the famous K9, whose record of discoveries had earned him local hero status. Others rolled their eyes, muttering about theatrics. To them, this was nothing more than a strategy by the prosecution to stir emotions. After all, what could a dog add to the facts of the case? Martin Cole, the defense attorney, leaned toward his client with a smirk. He whispered something that made Raymond Cross chuckle under his breath. They were confident. Too confident. When the recess ended, Judge Chambers adjusted his glasses, his brow furrowed. "Counselor," he said, addressing Hayes, "I assume there's a good reason the K9 is inside this courtroom and not outside with his handler?" Melissa Hayes stood, straightening her blazer. "Yes, Your Honor. While the dog's role in this proceeding is not to present direct evidence, his presence is relevant. He was part of the initial search and subsequent investigation. We believe that allowing him here provides context for our witness. Martin Cole shot to his feet, his tone mocking. Context? With respect, Your Honor, this is absurd. A courtroom is not a stage for theatrics. What's next, a parade of mascots to cheer on the prosecution? Laughter trickled faintly from the gallery, but Cole's smirk quickly vanished when Chambers leveled a cold stare at him. "Sit down, Mr. Cole," the judge ordered. "The dog may remain, but let me make it clear he is not to be treated as a witness. The court will not entertain barking as testimony." A ripple of chuckles passed through the room, but the tension was quick to return. Officer Daniels gave Rex a quiet command. The dog lay down at his feet, still alert, head resting on his paws, but eyes flickering constantly around the room. To anyone watching closely, though, it was clear his attention kept sliding back toward Emily. She had returned to her seat after the recess, her stuffed rabbit back in her lap. Her breathing was shallow, but she wasn't fidgeting anymore. Every so often, she glanced toward Rex, and each time, it was as though the weight on her small shoulders lightened, just a fraction. Melissa Hayes noticed it too. She tapped her pen against her notepad, filing the detail away. It wasn't planned, but it might just be the break they needed. The prosecution began calling additional witnesses. Officers detailed how Rex had detected narcotics hidden in obscure corners of Cross's house. One explained how the dog had signaled toward the very area where illegal substances were later found. Martin Cole pounced on the opportunity to undermine. "Dogs, ladies and gentlemen," he declared to the jury during cross-examination, "are animals. Animals act on instinct. They are not machines. They make mistakes. They misinterpret smells. They respond to their handlers' unspoken cues. How convenient, isn't it, that the same dog who found drugs at my client's property is now sitting in this courtroom, staring in the direction of my client as if on cue?" He turned, gesturing theatrically toward Rex. "Do you see? He's staring right now. What should we conclude? That my client is guilty because an animal looks his way?" The jurors chuckled nervously, unsure whether to agree or to distrust Cole's confidence. Rex, unaffected, simply blinked and shifted his gaze back to Emily. Officer Daniels, calm and steady, corrected him. "With respect, sir, Rex doesn't stare on command. He's trained to observe, to wait. He doesn't react unless something draws him. And if you're asking me why he looks at that young girl, it's because he remembers her. Dogs don't forget." That statement, simple and factual, sent a ripple through the room. Emily stiffened at the words. She hugged her rabbit closer, her lips pressing into a thin line. For a second, her eyes darted to Cross. The smirk on his face had returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. They were sharp now, watchful, and full of something darker, something only Emily seemed to recognize. Hayes decided it was time to bring the moment closer to its breaking point. She approached the bench. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests permission to call our key witness, Emily Carson." The gallery grew restless again. Everyone had known this was coming, but now that the moment was here, the atmosphere tightened like a drum. The judge gave a small nod. "Proceed." The bailiff moved to guide Emily toward the stand. She hesitated for only a second before rising. Her sneakers squeaked once more, that tiny sound echoing unnaturally loud in the hush. As she passed Rex, the dog's ears perked. His body rose slightly, his tail shifting in a subtle wag. Emily's eyes met his, and for the first time that day, her lips curved into the ghost of a smile. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Cross shifted uncomfortably. Cole leaned in, whispering urgently, but Cross's eyes stayed locked on Emily. The smirk had slipped again. Emily climbed onto the witness chair, her stuffed rabbit in her lap. The oath was administered. She raised her hand, her small fingers trembling, and swore to tell the truth. Melissa Hayes gave her a reassuring nod, her voice soft when she began. "Emily, do you remember the night the police came to your house?" Emily nodded, her eyes dropping to the rabbit. "Can you tell the jury what you saw?" Her lips parted, but no words came. She glanced toward Cross, and the color drained from her face. Her chest rose and fell faster, panic threatening to take hold. Hayes softened her tone further. "It's okay, Emily. You're safe here." The silence was unbearable. Even the reporters had stopped writing, pens hovering above their notebooks. Then, unexpectedly, Emily turned her head again toward Rex. The dog was sitting upright now, eyes fixed on her, body tense but calm, as if waiting for her to say something. For the first time since the trial began, Emily's fear eased just enough for her to breathe. She looked back at Hayes, then at the judge. She didn't speak yet, but she didn't need to. The shift was visible to everyone. Rex had anchored her. And though no one could have predicted it, the bond between a frightened little girl and a loyal police dog was about to change the course of everything that happened next. The hush inside the courtroom was suffocating. Every eye was on Emily, perched nervously in the oversized witness chair. Her legs dangled, her sneakers never reaching the floor, and her small fingers twisted the ears of her stuffed rabbit in a desperate attempt to stay calm. She looked impossibly small against the vastness of the oak-paneled courtroom, like a child lost in a maze built for adults. Melissa Hayes, standing just a few feet away, spoke softly. "Emily, can you tell us what happened that night?" Emily swallowed hard. Her lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but nothing came out. She stole a glance at the defendant, Raymond Cross, and her entire body tensed. His eyes were locked on her, piercing, cold, unblinking. He didn't need to say a word. His stare alone reminded her of whispered threats from the shadows, promises of what would happen if she spoke against him. Her gaze darted away, settling on the polished wood of the railing in front of her. Her chest rose and fell in quick, shallow breaths. For a moment, it seemed like she might bolt from the chair and run. "Take your time, sweetheart," Hayes reassured her gently. "You're safe here." The words offered comfort, but Emily's fear was louder than reason. She shifted her rabbit from one hand to the other, her knuckles turning white from the grip. The silence stretched so long that the courtroom began to buzz with impatience. Judge Chambers cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking through. "The witness may have some water." A bailiff approached with a cup. Emily accepted it, though her hands shook so badly the water rippled against the sides. She sipped, but her voice remained trapped somewhere deep inside. The defense attorney, Martin Cole, stood. His polished shoes clicked on the floor as he approached, a shark scenting blood in the water. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "while we all admire the bravery of this child, it's clear she's overwhelmed. Perhaps we should reconsider if she's truly fit to provide reliable testimony." Hayes bristled. "She's fit, she's here, and she will testify." Cole turned to Emily, his tone shifting to feigned gentleness. "Emily, you know it's important to tell the truth, right?" She nodded timidly. "And the truth can sometimes be confusing. Sometimes we remember things differently after hearing adults talk. Isn't that right?" Emily's grip on her rabbit tightened. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're 10 years old," Cole continued, his voice honeyed but his words sharp. 10-year-olds are easily influenced. It's natural. Maybe you've been told stories about Mr. Cross. Maybe you've heard things that made you scared of him. But that doesn't mean they're true, does it? The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned, others scribbled notes. Cole's strategy was clear, plant seeds of doubt. Emily's eyes flicked once more to Cross. His mouth twitched into the faintest smirk, just enough for her to see. Her stomach churned. She remembered the nights when his voice had hissed warnings, when his presence had filled her home with dread. Her throat tightened. Words clawed at the back of her mind, desperate to escape, but fear clamped down like a vice. Melissa Hayes stepped forward quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is leading the witness and intimidating her." "Sustained," Judge Chambers said sharply, glaring at Cole. "Mr. Cole, keep your questions appropriate." Cole raised his hands innocently and retreated a step, but the damage was done. Emily sat frozen, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. The gallery stirred. People shifted in their seats, exchanging whispers. Some pitied the girl. Others doubted her. Even the reporters scribbled faster, their pens scratching headlines about a witness too scared to speak. Hayes leaned closer, her voice soft but firm. "Emily, do you see that officer with the dog over there?" Emily's eyes lifted hesitantly toward Rex. The German shepherd was still at Officer Daniel's side, but he wasn't lying down anymore. He sat tall, ears pricked, watching her intently. His gaze was steady, unwavering. Something shifted in Emily's chest. Unlike Cross's stare, which made her shrink into herself, Rex's eyes carried no malice, no threat. There was only focus, loyalty, and something she couldn't explain, almost like understanding. She blinked at him, her breath slowing just slightly. Hayes noticed. "That's Rex. He was there that night too, remember?" Emily nodded faintly, her rabbit sliding onto her lap as her hands loosened. Memories flooded back the chaos of flashing police lights, officers swarming her house, Rex bounding through the doorway, nose pressed to the floor. He had been determined, certain, like he knew exactly what he was looking for. She remembered how safe she had felt when he had sat beside her afterward, his warm fur brushing against her arm as the officers carried Cross away in handcuffs. "Yes," she whispered. The single word was barely audible, but it was the first she had spoken since taking the stand. The courtroom seemed to collectively inhale. Hayes leaned in, her tone careful, coaxing. "Can you tell us what Rex did that night?" Emily's lips parted again, but she hesitated. Her eyes flickered back to Cross. His expression was colder now, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits. Fear surged through her again, silencing her words before they could form. Rex shifted. He rose onto all fours, ears standing higher, his attention fixed squarely on her. He didn't make a sound, but his presence filled the room with a silent kind of encouragement. Emily's heart pounded, torn between fear and courage. Her mind screamed at her to stay quiet, but the dog's steady gaze anchored her, holding her in place. The judge spoke gently, his usual sternness softened. "Emily, no one here can hurt you. You're safe in this courtroom." She nodded, but her eyes drifted back to Rex. Her small shoulders straightened ever so slightly. Cole's lips curled into another smirk. "See, Your Honor? The child isn't speaking because there's nothing for her to say." He spread his arms toward the jury. "She's frightened, yes, but fear isn't the same as truth." The jurors watched him carefully. Some seemed unconvinced by his confidence. Others looked uncertain, caught between pity for Emily and doubt in her silence. Melissa Hayes clenched her jaw. She knew this wasn't enough. Emily had to speak, or the case could unravel. But she also knew she couldn't push too hard, or risk breaking the fragile thread holding the girl together. The silence stretched again, heavy and unbearable. The ticking of the courtroom clock grew louder, each second dragging like an eternity. And then it happened. Emily's hand released the rabbit entirely. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking with Rex's. The dog tilted his head, ears twitching, as though he understood something no one else could. For the first time since entering the courtroom, Emily didn't look afraid. She looked determined, her lips parted. A whisper escaped, so soft the microphones barely caught it. And though no one could have predicted the words she would soon speak, the atmosphere in the room shifted in that moment. The silence wasn't just silence anymore. It was a pause, a breath, the instant before everything changed. The silence in the courtroom stretched on, almost unbearable, like a taut string, threatening to snap at any moment. All eyes remained on the girl, but she wasn't looking at anyone, at least, not anyone human. Her gaze had shifted down to the sleek German shepherd, sitting obediently beside his handler near the witness stand. The canine's golden brown eyes stared back at her, calm and steady. His ears twitched, his body alert, as though he too sensed the tension crawling through the room. For the first time since stepping into the courtroom, the young girl's shoulders eased slightly. Her tiny hands, which had been clamped so tightly to the wooden rail of the witness box, loosened their grip. It was as if, in that moment, she recognized something familiar, something safe, in the animal's unwavering stare. The handler, a broad-shouldered officer in uniform, noticed the shift immediately. He had worked with this canine for years, and had witnessed the uncanny way the dog could connect with people, especially those who were vulnerable or frightened. Slowly, carefully, he stepped closer, his boots clicking softly against the polished floor. The dog padded forward in perfect rhythm, never breaking his gaze from the little girl. The defense attorney rose quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. What is the purpose of bringing the animal this close to the witness? This is a courtroom, not a circus." The judge raised a hand to silence him. His eyes, too, had caught the change in the girl's demeanor. "Overruled. Continue." The prosecutor seized the chance. "Miss," he said softly, crouching down so his voice wouldn't loom over her, "do you feel safer when the officer and his dog are near you?" For the first time, she nodded. A visible ripple spread through the courtroom like air, finally released after being held too long. The dog sat obediently, his tongue lolling slightly, but his posture was alert. The girl stared at him, her breathing more even now. It was as though she wasn't addressing the court anymore, but only this silent guardian at her side. "Would you like to tell him what you remember?" The prosecutor asked gently, motioning toward the canine. "You don't have to look at anyone else. Just talk to him." The girl's lips trembled. She hesitated, glancing sideways at the defendant, whose face had gone rigid with unease. He didn't look so smug anymore. His jaw tightened, and his fingers tapped restlessly against the table. The little girl took a shaky breath, then leaned slightly forward, her eyes never leaving the canine's. She whispered something too soft for anyone to hear. The court reporter strained to listen. "Can you repeat that?" a prosecutor asked kindly. Her chin lifted just enough for her voice to be heard. "Find him." The two words cut through the courtroom like a blade. Gasps erupted, followed by stunned silence. The canine's ears shot up, and in an instant his body stiffened, his nose twitching as though he had been given a direct command. The handler braced himself, holding firmly to the leash, but the dog surged forward, growling low and deep. His entire focus locked on the defendant at the table. The growl vibrated through the air, primal and undeniable. "Order, order in the court." The judge thundered, banging his gavel, but even he could not hide the shock in his voice. The defendant flinched backward, his earlier confidence evaporating. His face turned pale as the dog's unrelenting gaze bore into him. "Objection." The defense attorney barked, though his voice cracked under the pressure. This is highly irregular. Dogs don't decide guilt." "No," the prosecutor countered firmly, standing taller now. "But children don't invent memories like this. And this canine has been trained for years to detect the scent of criminals." The girl's words triggered his instinct. The handler tried to soothe the dog, but the animal refused to look away, his growl growing louder. It wasn't random, it was recognition, and everyone could see it. The little girl, with tears running down her cheeks, finally found her voice. "That's what he did. That night. He growled the same way. He wouldn't stop looking at him. She pointed directly at the defendant, her finger trembling but steady enough for the jury to see. The courtroom seemed frozen in that moment. The jury sat stiff, their eyes wide. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Even the bailiffs shifted uneasily, their hands near their belts as if the tension itself might erupt into violence. The judge banged the gavel again, though his usual sternness was replaced by something else, something closer to disbelief. "This court will come to order." Still, the words echoed in every mind. "Find him." And the image of the K9, focused and unyielding, was impossible to dismiss. The prosecutor stepped closer, his tone firm yet respectful. "Your Honor, this child's courage has just provided this courtroom with something no one else could. A direct connection between the crime and the man sitting at that table. Combined with the dog's reaction, this is more than coincidence." The defense attorney stood, sweating now, his face flushed. "This is outrageous. You cannot condemn my client based on a dog's growl." "No one is asking us to," the judge replied, his voice low but cutting. "But the jury will remember this moment. And so will I." The girl wiped her tears, her breathing steadier. For the first time since entering the courtroom, she sat taller, no longer crushed by fear. It was as if speaking those two words had lifted a weight from her tiny shoulders. The K9, sensing her calm, finally lowered his growl, but never looked away from the defendant. His duty was clear, and in that moment, the entire courtroom understood. The trial had shifted. Something irreversible had been set in motion. The once silent witness had spoken. The loyal K9 had confirmed what she dared not say outright. And the defendant, though still free to smirk and deny, could no longer hide from the truth that now hung over him like a shadow. The turning point had come not with a dramatic speech, not with a mountain of evidence, but with two simple words whispered to a dog. And the effect left every soul in that courtroom frozen. For a heartbeat after the girl's trembling voice rang out, the courtroom was utterly silent. The words, "Find him," seemed to hang suspended in the heavy air, vibrating against the walls, as though the building itself had heard them. The jurors exchanged uncertain glances, pens stilled mid-scribble. Even the ceiling fans overhead seemed to slow. Then the K9 moved. The German shepherd, so composed just moments earlier, surged forward with raw precision. His ears pinned back, his nostrils flared, and a guttural growl rumbled from his chest like distant thunder. The handler braced instantly, yanking firmly on the leash, but the dog's focus was absolute. His body lunged not toward the spectators, not randomly into the room, but directly, unmistakably, at the defense table. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone in the gallery dropped a notebook. A woman clutched her pearls. The sound of the dog's claws scraping against the polished wood floor filled the chamber, a primal counterpoint to the defendant's sudden gasp of panic. The man who had worn smug confidence for weeks now recoiled, scooting his chair back so quickly it screeched against the tiles. His face drained of color. His hands, once folded neatly in composure, now clutched the table's edge like he was holding on to the last scrap of safety. The judge's gavel cracked against the block. "Order! Order in the court!" His voice echoed, but it could not drown out the steady, menacing growl of the dog. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, his voice breaking under the strain. "Objection. This is completely unacceptable. Dogs are animals, not witnesses. This reaction means nothing at all." But his words fell flat. Every person in that room could see the difference between coincidence and certainty. The K9 wasn't confused, wasn't distracted, he was locked in. His golden brown eyes never strayed from the defendant, as though he had been waiting for this moment all along. The prosecutor stepped forward, his tone calm but cutting. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, What you're seeing is not random behavior. This is a highly trained canine whose sole purpose is to detect, track, and identify. He is not guessing. He is not acting out of instinct alone. He is responding because the child's words triggered recognition of the man sitting at that table. The jurors leaned in, pens moving again in frantic scribbles. Some exchanged hushed words, their expressions betraying shock and dawning clarity. The defendant tried to collect himself, forcing a laugh that sounded brittle. What? I'm supposed to be afraid of a dog? He probably smells the lunch I had earlier. But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. The little girl, still on the witness stand, pointed a trembling finger toward him. That's what happened before, she whispered, her eyes glistening. The night everything happened. The dog growled at him the same way. He wouldn't stop. Her words struck like a hammer. Murmurs erupted across the courtroom, spectators shifting in their seats. The judge banged the gavel again, but the energy had shifted entirely. What had begun as a fragile testimony was now an undeniable turning point. The handler knelt beside the canine, giving firm commands in low tones. Slowly, reluctantly, the dog eased back, though his growl simmered beneath the surface. His gaze, however, never wavered. He remained a sentinel, locked onto the defendant with unwavering suspicion. The defense attorney was nearly shouting now. Your Honor, I demand this dog be removed immediately. This spectacle is poisoning the jury. But the judge's voice cut through with authority. Sit down, counselor. The jury will weigh what they've seen with their own eyes. The dog will remain for now. The defendant's mask cracked further. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead, glistening under the fluorescent lights. He shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar as if it had grown too tight. Every movement betrayed his unraveling composure. The prosecutor, sensing blood in the water, pressed forward. Miss, can you tell us, in your own words, what you remember about that night? The girl's voice trembled, but carried strength it hadn't before. I remember hiding. I was so scared. And then the dog. He barked, and he growled at that man. She pointed again at the defendant. I never forgot it. The sound was the same. I was too scared to say anything before. But I know it was him. The courtroom erupted again. Gasps, whispers, tension so thick it was almost suffocating. The girl's testimony, paired with the canine's instinctive reaction, had created a scene no lawyer could have scripted, no actor could have staged. It was raw, real, and unforgettable. The judge leaned forward, his expression stern but intrigued. The witness has spoken clearly, and the jury has witnessed the dog's response. This will remain part of the record. The defense attorney sputtered, This is madness. But his voice lacked conviction. He knew, as did everyone else, that the tide had turned. The canine finally settled into a rigid sit, still watching, still waiting. His handler rested a steadying hand on his collar, whispering praise to keep him calm. But the dog's body remained coiled like a spring, his instincts humming in the tense silence. The little girl wiped her tears, but her chin was lifted now, her courage evident. She wasn't the timid, trembling child who had entered the courtroom earlier. She had spoken, and her words, backed by the loyal guardian at her side, had changed everything. The defendant slumped in his chair, his eyes darting between the jurors, the girl, and the dog. For the first time, he looked cornered, stripped of his arrogance. The prosecutor turned to the jury, his voice steady, resonant. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, the truth is not shouted. Sometimes it is whispered. And sometimes it is confirmed by those who cannot lie. What you have witnessed today is not coincidence. It is connection between a child who lived the fear and a canine who recognized the truth. The jurors sat frozen, absorbing every word. And though the trial was far from over, everyone in that courtroom knew The defense's armor had cracked, and no amount of smooth talking could fully repair it. The two words had unleashed something powerful, something undeniable. The girl had spoken. The dog had confirmed. And the courtroom would never be the same again. For a long, heavy moment, the entire courtroom seemed suspended in time. The gavel had been struck. Objections had been shouted, but none of it mattered. Every single person's focus was locked on the dog. The K9 remained frozen in his rigid sit, his chest rising and falling in steady bursts, his teeth bared just enough to expose the low rumble that continued in his throat. His handler's grip was firm, but it was clear the dog wasn't reacting out of confusion or nervousness. He was locked on the defendant like a compass needle on true north. The jurors stared, wide-eyed, their pens forgotten. A few leaned toward each other, whispering rapidly, but even their whispers were swallowed by the dog's growl. The bailiffs stood stiff at their posts, unsure if they should move or wait for instruction. The judge sat higher in his chair, his gavel still in hand but unused now, his eyes fixed on the strange spectacle before him. And at the center of it all was the young girl. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her breathing had steadied. She was no longer shrinking into herself. Instead, she sat up straighter, her eyes fixed not on the defendant, but on the K9, her silent ally. It was as though she drew courage directly from his presence, as though the dog's refusal to back down gave her permission to do the same. The defendant shifted in his seat, beads of sweat clinging to his forehead. He forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. "This is ridiculous. You can't let a child and a mutt decide the outcome of a trial." The words rang hollow. Even his attorney, usually quick to echo such defiance, seemed hesitant, glancing nervously at the jury. The prosecutor rose slowly, his voice calm but edged with purpose. "Miss," he said gently, addressing the girl, "you mentioned something just now. You said the dog did the same thing before. Can you tell us what you meant by that?" The girl's eyes flicked to the defendant, just for a second. Fear threatened to return, but then her gaze returned to the K9, who sat unwavering, still growling low. She took a deep breath, her small fingers curling into fists on her lap. "It was the night of the raid," she said, her voice trembling but audible. "I was hiding behind the couch. I was so scared I couldn't move. And then I heard the dog. He barked and growled, just like now. And he wouldn't stop looking at him." She raised her hand, pointing directly at the defendant. "At him." Gasps erupted from the gallery. Reporters' pens flew across notepads. Fingers tapped furiously on laptops. The judge banged the gavel, demanding order, but the energy in the room refused to settle. The words of a child, simple, unpolished, had just painted a vivid picture that no juror could ignore. The defense attorney leapt to his feet. "Objection. She's a frightened child, recalling fragments of memory. Dogs growl at all sorts of people. This is theatrics, nothing more." The judge turned his piercing gaze on him. "Sit down, counselor. The jury will decide what is memory and what is not. I will not silence this witness." The defense attorney faltered, his voice caught in his throat. Slowly, reluctantly, he lowered himself back into his chair. The prosecutor leaned forward, his tone softer now. "You're very brave," he told the girl. "You've carried this memory with you for a long time, haven't you?" She nodded quickly, biting her lip. "I wanted to say something before, but he always scared me." Her eyes flickered toward the defendant again, who sat hunched now, his knuckles white as he gripped the table. "Every time I thought about him, I couldn't breathe." She paused, tears spilling fresh down her cheeks. "But the dog remembers too. He knows it was him." The canine's growl deepened, as if punctuating her words. The handler gave a sharp command, easing him, but the dog's body remained tense, muscles coiled. The prosecutor let the silence hang for a moment before speaking again. Your Honor, what we've just witnessed is extraordinary. This child's words, supported by the dog's undeniable recognition, create a connection no cross-examination can erase. This is not coincidence. This is truth remembered. The judge didn't respond immediately. He sat back, hands steepled beneath his chin, his expression unreadable. But the jurors, their faces told the story. They had seen the defendant's smug confidence melt into visible fear. They had seen the girl's transformation from silence to strength. And most of all, they had seen the canine-trained, disciplined, uncheckable react with unmistakable certainty. The defense attorney tried again, his tone pleading now rather than confident. We cannot allow this kind of spectacle to dictate justice. A dog cannot testify. This is nothing but emotional manipulation. But no one was listening. Not the jury, not the reporters, not even the spectators. The image had been burned into their minds. The defendant shifted again, tugging at his collar. His jaw worked as though he was grinding his teeth. For the first time, he looked cornered, trapped. Every eye in the room was on him, and no amount of clever lawyering could erase what they had just seen. The girl lowered her hand, her tears still flowing, but her voice grew steadier with each word. That night I heard voices. I saw him. And when the dog came in, he went straight to him. Just like today, she inhaled shakily. I thought nobody would believe me. But now you have to. The prosecutor bowed his head slightly, almost reverent. Thank you, he said softly. The judge finally spoke, his voice low but firm. This court has witnessed something unusual, yes. But sometimes justice reveals itself in unexpected ways. The jury will consider what they've seen today very carefully. The gavel struck once more, but even the sound could not erase the memory of the moment. The child pointing, the dog growling, and the defendant paling under the weight of it all. The courtroom was frozen, not because of silence, but because everyone knew the trial had crossed a threshold. The facade had cracked. The truth was clawing its way out. And for the defendant, there was no hiding anymore. The courtroom still vibrated with the echoes of the girl's words and the dog's growl. It was as though the very air had thickened, heavy with the realization that the trial had shifted beyond the defense's control. No amount of objections or legal theatrics could erase what everyone had just witnessed. The defense attorney tried anyway. He rose abruptly, tugging at his suit jacket, his face flushed with desperation. Your Honor, I must move for a mistrial. This entire proceeding has been contaminated by emotional manipulation. That child has been coached, and the dog's reaction proves nothing. I demand immediate dismissal. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. Sit down, counselor. There will be no mistrial. This court will proceed. The defense attorney froze, his mouth still open as though he'd been struck across the face. Slowly, reluctantly, he sank back into his chair, his eyes darting nervously toward his client. The defendant leaned in close, whispering furiously, his jaw clenched tight. Whatever words passed between them were lost under the murmur of the gallery, but the tension was obvious. The defendant's once smug demeanor was gone, replaced by something jagged panic mixed with rage. The prosecutor stepped forward, steady, deliberate. He looked toward the jury, his voice calm yet cutting. Ladies and gentlemen, you have seen the girl's courage. You have seen the K-9's recognition. But that is not the only evidence you will hear today. Courage has a way of spreading. He turned toward the benches behind him, scanning the rows of faces. For weeks, many had stayed silent. Witnesses who had feared retaliation, who had convinced themselves it was safer not to get involved. But now the silence felt cowardly in the face of the little girl's bravery. One man stood. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. Your Honor, he said, addressing the court. I can't stay quiet anymore. The gallery erupted in gasps. Reporters bolted upright, pens poised. The judge leaned forward. State your name. The man cleared his throat. James Porter. I was there that night too. I saw him. He pointed straight at the defendant. I saw him leaving. I didn't want to believe it. I thought if I stayed out of it, nothing would happen to me. But I can't keep this secret anymore, not after what she just did. He gestured toward the girl. Chaos broke out, gasps, whispers, even a few cries from the gallery. The judge hammered his gavel. Order! Order in this courtroom. The prosecutor's eyes gleamed. Mr. Porter, are you prepared to testify under oath? Yes, Porter said, his voice firmer now. Yes, I am. The defense attorney bolted to his feet, his voice cracking with fury. This is outrageous. Surprise witnesses, unsubstantiated claims, this is nothing but a circus. But the judge overruled him again. Mr. Porter will be sworn in. Bailiff, bring him forward. As Porter was escorted to the stand, the defendant's face grew stormy. His lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. He whispered something harshly to his attorney, who paled at whatever was said. Porter raised his hand, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair. His gaze flickered nervously toward the defendant, but then he found the girl's eyes. She gave him the smallest, tear-stained nod. It was enough. I saw him, Porter said again, voice clear now. I saw the defendant that night. I saw him near the warehouse, the same place where? He hesitated, swallowing hard. Where everything went down. The police dog was there too. He was growling then, just like he did today. I should have said something then, but I was scared. He's dangerous. The jury sat frozen, every word etched into their memory. The prosecutor let the silence linger before asking, Why are you speaking now? Porter's eyes softened as he glanced once more at the young girl. Because if she can find the courage, then so can I. I won't let her carry this alone. The gallery erupted again, a mix of applause and gasps before the gavel thundered them into silence. The defense attorney scrambled desperately, firing off questions meant to discredit Porter. You waited months before coming forward? Convenient. Were you offered anything in exchange for this testimony? Porter shook his head firmly. No. I came forward because I couldn't stomach the lies anymore. The truth eats at you, and I won't let it eat me alive anymore. Each word chipped away at the defense's crumbling wall. The defendant, once stone-faced, could no longer hide the storm brewing inside him. His leg bounced nervously beneath the table, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. Sweat darkened the collar of his shirt. He whispered furiously at his attorney, who shook his head in panic, unable to contain the unraveling. The prosecutor circled like a predator. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just heard is not just testimony. It is a confession of silence broken. When one voice speaks, others follow. Truth has a way of spreading, and truth always finds the guilty. The jurors exchanged looks of grim understanding. The defendant finally snapped. He slammed a fist against the table, startling even his own attorney. They're all liars. Every one of them. His voice boomed through the chamber, ragged and desperate. You're all out to get me. The judge pounded his gavel furiously. You will control yourself in my courtroom, sir. But the eruption had already betrayed him. The mask of calm, the carefully rehearsed smirk, the false composure all gone. What remained was raw, unfiltered fear. The canine growled again, louder this time, as though sensing the unraveling facade. The handler tightened his grip, but his eyes met the prosecutor's in silent acknowledgement. The dog's instincts had been right all along. The girl, still seated on the witness stand, no longer looked afraid. She watched the defendant's outburst with wide but steady eyes, her small frame radiating a quiet strength. She had faced her fear, and now the man who haunted her nightmares was the one trembling. The judge ordered a recess, his gavel striking until the noise subsided. But the damage was done. The trial could no longer be framed as doubt versus proof. The tide had turned irrevocably. The defense's strategy lay in ruins. Witnesses were stepping forward. The defendant's composure was shattered. And the jury, who had watched every moment unfold, now saw the man before them not as an innocent victim, but as a predator cornered by truth. As the bailiffs moved to restore order, the defendant slumped in his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The unraveling had begun, and it would not stop until justice had its due. The tension in the courtroom was thick as the recess ended. People filed back into their seats, whispers passing between them like restless winds. The defendant sat rigid at the defense table, his jaw set in stone, though his eyes betrayed the chaos inside. He had lost control, and everyone knew it. The girl returned quietly to her seat beside her guardian, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though the storm had swirled around her, she had faced it head-on. A K-9, sitting calmly now, had shifted from tension to quiet watchfulness, his head tilted toward her protectively, as though he knew his role was nearly complete. When the judge re-entered, the gavel's strike silenced the room instantly. "Court will reconvene," he said, his voice firm but weary. He had presided over countless cases, but this one carried a weight unlike the others. The prosecutor rose first. He did not shout. He did not need theatrics. His voice was steady, clear, sharpened by the truth that had been revealed piece by piece. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen the courage of a child, the recognition of a dog, trained to sense what we cannot, and the testimony of those who could no longer carry the burden of silence. You have also seen the defendant's mask break, the panic, the rage, the guilt leaking through his every word and action. Justice is not about vengeance. It is about truth. And the truth is spoken loudly in this courtroom. Now it is your turn to speak." He sat down, his gaze steady on the jury. The defense attorney rose with none of his earlier swagger. His voice trembled slightly as he made his closing argument. "The prosecution wants you to believe in theatrics and instincts. They want you to convict on emotion rather than evidence. Yes, emotions run high, but we must not forget the principle of reasonable doubt." His eyes darted toward the jury, pleading rather than persuading. "If there is any doubt, you cannot convict." But his words fell flat. The jury's eyes did not meet his. They had seen too much, felt too much. The judge gave his instructions carefully, emphasizing fairness, burden of proof, and the gravity of their duty. Then the jury filed out, leaving the courtroom in a heavy, electric silence. Minutes dragged into hours. Reporters scribbled, cameras clicked outside, and the defendant tapped his fingers in a frantic rhythm on the table. He whispered to his attorney, who barely nodded, his shoulders slumped as though he already knew what was coming. The girl leaned gently against her guardian, exhaustion weighing her down. Yet there was something peaceful in her face now, as if the hardest part had already passed. The K-9, sensing her calm, settled at her feet, his body like a shield between her and the world. At last the jury returned. Their faces were unreadable, masks of solemn duty. The foreperson clutched a folded piece of paper in trembling hands. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge instructed. The room held its breath as the defendant stood, shoulders squared, chin high, but the beads of sweat on his forehead betrayed him. The paper was handed to the bailiff, then to the judge, who unfolded it and read silently for a moment. The courtroom felt suspended, as though time itself had halted. Then the judge handed the verdict back to the foreperson. In the case of the state versus the defendant, the foreperson read, voice steady despite the trembling of her hands. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts. The words struck like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Some cried out, others clapped hands over their mouths. The girl inhaled sharply, her eyes wide, then filled with tears, not of fear this time, but of release. The defendant's face twisted. Rage flared, his fists clenched, and for a moment it seemed he might erupt again. Bailiff stepped forward instantly, ready to restrain him. But he didn't fight. His body sagged, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of the verdict. The fight was gone. The judge's gavel thundered. Order! Order! The defendant will be remanded into custody immediately. Sentencing will be scheduled at a later date. Court is adjourned. The bailiffs closed in, taking the defendant by the arms. He jerked once, muttering curses under his breath, but they dragged him firmly away. The sound of shackles echoed faintly as the door closed behind him. And just like that, the storm was over. For a long moment, the room was silent. People blinked at one another, absorbing the enormity of what had just happened. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then stronger, spreading through the courtroom like a wave. It wasn't celebration. It was relief. The girl sat still, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time they carried no fear. Her guardian pulled her close, holding her as though she would never let go. The prosecutor approached quietly, kneeling to her level. You were braver than anyone today, he said softly. Because of you, justice was served. The girl nodded, her small voice whispering, because of him too. She glanced at the K9. The dog wagged his tail gently, leaning his head against her leg. The courtroom watched, hearts softened by the purity of the moment. A child and a dog, symbols of innocence and loyalty, had stood against darkness and won. Outside, reporters scrambled for quotes, cameras flashed, and the story spread like wildfire. But inside, the quiet was sacred. People lingered, unwilling to break the spell of what they had witnessed. The defense attorney gathered his papers with shaking hands, avoiding the stares of the crowd. His career might never recover, but in that moment, it hardly mattered. The truth had outshone everything. As the courtroom emptied, the girl stood, her guardian guiding her toward the exit. She paused by the K9 one last time, kneeling to hug him tightly. Thank you, she whispered, her voice steady and sure. The dog leaned into her embrace, his tail thumping softly against the floor. The prosecutor watched, a lump in his throat. He had won cases before, but never one that carried such raw humanity. This wasn't just justice served in the eyes of the law, it was justice felt in the soul. The judge, still seated at the bench, removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He had seen countless trials, countless verdicts. But this one he would remember. Not because of the legal maneuvers or the evidence presented, but because of a child's bravery and a dog's instinct that pierced through layers of fear and silence. In the end, the courtroom froze not in horror, but in awe. They had witnessed something pure, the undeniable triumph of truth. And as the girl walked out into the sunlight, hand in hand with her guardian, the weight of fear no longer pressing down on her shoulders, she took one last glance back. The door to the courtroom closed, but inside her heart, the chapter had already ended. The nightmare was over. Justice had spoken. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was peace.